Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And we're very pleased to bring you a very special guest for this month's episode.
On the 23rd of September, we'll be joined at Alnwick Castle by historian, author and broadcaster Tracy Borman in support of her new book, The Stolen Crown, Treachery, Deceit and the Death of the Tudor Dynasty. Tickets are still available from the Alnwick Castle website or by searching for us on Eventbrite.
The Stolen Crown is a story of iconic women, espionage, conspiracy and power as various claimants to the throne of Elizabeth I attempt to position themselves as her successor, and the results of these events change the monarchy forever. It may also not be too surprising to find that Henry Percy, the Wizard Earl of Northumberland, and an Alnwick Castle podcast favourite, was involved in some of the intrigue.
Tracy joined us on the podcast to talk all about the book, and here's our conversation with her. Please enjoy. We're very happy to be joined again on the Alnwick Castle podcast by Chief Historian for Historic Royal Palaces and now author of The Stolen Crown, Tracy Borman. Thank you for being with us again, Tracy. How are you?
Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for having me back. It's lovely to be here. And yes, I'm very well. I'm very excited because I haven't yet had a finished copy of The Stolen Crown in my hands. We've had the proofs, but any day now, every time the postman arrives, I'm thinking, will it be today?
Do you start with just getting one book or do you get a whole box
Yes,
full?
I tend to get one and then my sort of main box full of author copies arrives. So, and I think it's my 18th book and it's just as exciting as the first time. Like the novelty never wears off for me. I get so overexcited about it. So what I've got to do though is intercept my dog Cromwell, because last time when my author copy arrived, he got to it first. And suffice to say, it is now a bit chewed.
Yes. There's probably something about Cromwell destroying evidence of things happening in the Tudor court, isn't there?
There is. I'm sure we could think of something, yeah.
But I think Cromwell the human doesn't show up in The Stolen Crown because these are about events a little bit later in the 16th century.
Yeah.
What could you tell us to start off about what inspired this book?
So, yeah, absolutely. Cromwell doesn't make an appearance. It's well after his death. My book was inspired by groundbreaking, thrilling new research by the British Library, led by Helena Rutowska, who is studying at the University of Oxford. So it's a collaborative research project with the British Library. And she was researching William Camden's Annals of Elizabeth. Camden was Elizabeth's earliest biographer. He started his account of her reign while she was still living and then completed it once James was on the throne. But what Helena and the team have shown is that Camden, who was under pressure to complete this book from James, I think he'd have just let it die quietly after Elizabeth's death. Camden rewrote the book or large sections of the book once James was on the throne, under pressure from James, to make certain elements of the story of Elizabeth more favourable to him and to his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. And the biggest revelation, certainly in terms of my book, is that Elizabeth never left her throne to James. Now, that is pretty earth-shattering because for 400 years, historians, myself included, have taken Camden's account of Elizabeth's deathbed really as gospel. He's the earliest source that says, almost with her last breath, Elizabeth sort of gasped out, it'll be the King of Scots who succeeds me. And then she dies. But actually, what this new research shows is, in the original version, written in Elizabeth's lifetime, or at the time that the events were happening, no such mention is made. Elizabeth simply died without naming her heir. And actually, that's much more believable for a queen who had resisted pressure to name an heir for 44 long years. Why would she, at the last, finally go back on what had become her accustomed policy? She didn't want the attention on anybody else, even in her dying moments. Well, of course, this changes everything we thought we knew about this smooth transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts. It was all a foregone conclusion. And what my book does is to really look with fresh eyes at the question of who might have succeeded Elizabeth, because it was by no means a sure thing for James. There were many other candidates with a strong claim to Elizabeth's throne. And it's been wonderful for me to just go back and actually look at these candidates who I must admit I'd sort of dismissed as also rans, really, until this new research, which proves that actually they could easily have pipped James to the post. And we might even have had another Queen of England, not a king.
And that Queen, I think, is Arbella Stuart.
Yes, indeed, Arbella Stuart. So she was a cousin of James. She was the granddaughter of Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's elder sister. And her other grandmother was Bess of Hardwicke, so she was from pretty fine stock, was Arbella, but she was Stuart. And I should say at the outset, there was a problem with the Stuart claim because Henry VIII hated the Scots and he had barred any Stuart from ever inheriting the throne of England. He'd put that in an act of succession, and he had also enshrined it in his last will and testament. So actually, technically, both Arbella and James were illegal claimants. Neither really should have taken the throne. Of course, Arbella didn't, but she was probably James's closest rival in the later years of Elizabeth's reign. And it was against the law for James to take the throne. So in fact, Henry VIII had favoured the descendants of his younger sister, Mary, and they included the Grey sisters, Catherine and Mary, the sisters of Lady Jane Grey, the ill-fated short-reigning queen, and also the Stanleys, Lady Margaret Stanley and her sons, who were also descended from Henry VIII's sister, Mary. But there were others. There was an Earl of Northumberland, actually, who was thought to be have decent sort of royal blood flowing through his veins. So it was there were many claimants. I think at one count there were 14 claimants to Elizabeth's throne, and they weren't just drawn from England either. There was a Spanish one, and so there was a Portuguese. Yeah. It was by no means a one-horse race, I would say.
So it's the 9th Earl of Northumberland who comes up in a list of potential successors.
Yes.
He inherits his earldom in the 1580s. He manages to get through this whole period into James's reign, but he plays a role throughout the book and throughout this story. He's writing to the King of Scotland quite a lot.
He is. So actually, I would say James's accession was as much to do with his strong blood claim. Let's set aside the illegal nature of his claim. He had a strong blood claim, but also at least as much to do with powerful members of Elizabeth's court who helped to smooth his path to the throne, including, you're right, Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, a real mover and shaker in the court of Elizabeth I, and working very closely with Robert Cecil, her chief minister. Both of these men had decided that James was probably, I was going to say, the best of a bad lot. Maybe that's slightly rude, but there was no ideal, straightforward candidate. And I think they decided it was at least better to have somebody who had the strongest hereditary claim and also was male. And there was a real feeling in late Elizabethan England that it was high time the natural order was restored and a king was on the throne once more. They'd had 50 years of queens, three queens in a row, Mary, Lady Jane Grey, and Elizabeth, not in that order. I should have said Lady Jane Grey, Mary and Elizabeth. And people wanted a king. This was how it should be. Women weren't supposed to rule. And so, as I said, members of Elizabeth's council, they worked hand in glove with James and established this secret correspondence that passed between England and Scotland. And these advisors were telling James how to handle Elizabeth, what he should do to make himself acceptable to the people of England. Because Scotland, it's easy for us to underestimate this. And particularly it's easy perhaps for you being so close to Scotland. But Scotland was seen as a foreign country. It was as foreign a country as Spain or France. And there had been this long-standing hostility between the English and the Scots. So there was a great deal of opposition to the idea of a Stuart taking the throne. It wasn't just Henry VIII who was against it. Most of Elizabeth's subjects actually were against it. But as ever, it's the small minority in power who hold all the cards. And they're the ones, including the Earl of Northumberland, who seem to have pinned their colours to James's mast.
How early did they sort of start to really want him on the throne? How long was the correspondence going before Elizabeth actually died?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, that their desire for James perhaps was longer than their correspondence. The correspondence only really got going in the sort of later 1590s. So probably the last 5 or 6 years of Elizabeth's long reign, when the succession crisis was gathering ground. And it was a crisis. It had dominated Elizabeth's reign, because she came to the throne declaring that she would live and die a virgin. So she could never have children of her own, of course, if she didn't marry. And so she was constantly asked, who is going to be the heir? Now, by the 1590s, James had gathered a lot of support, but it was less, a sort of one-horse race and more survival of the fittest, because many of the other claimants by the 1590s had either died. I'm thinking of Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, and also Ferdinando Stanley, Lady Margaret Stanley's son. Both died in the sort of mid-1590s. Elizabeth had also persecuted most of the other claimants to her throne, including the Greys, Catherine Grey and her sons, and indeed grandsons, whereas she'd sort of left James alone. And I think that probably showed that he was her favourite candidate, not just members of her government. But the secret correspondence between James and Northumberland and Cecil and the rest, and even the Earl of Essex, that really got underway, as I said, in the later 1590s. Now, they had to take extreme care, you might imagine, in corresponding with the King of Scots, because it's treason to talk about the death of a king or queen. And they knew they'd be in serious trouble if Elizabeth found out. So they used code names. It was all very James Bond, actually. This espionage network was set up between the courts of England and Scotland so that these letters could be conveyed safely. They used code names. They went to enormous lengths to ensure that these letters went undetected. Did they succeed? I don't know. I think even if it was never declared by Elizabeth, I think Elizabeth knew exactly what was going on. And perhaps even she approved of it. Perhaps she wanted James's path to the throne to be smoothed, but she just didn't really want to name him her heir.
She didn't seem to really want to name anyone at any point. And this probably seems a stupid question, but why didn't she just pick someone?
Yeah, it's not a stupid question. It's rooted in Elizabeth's own experience during her sister Mary's reign, when she was the sort of heir presumptive, not a named heir, but it was sort of obvious that if Mary didn't have children, it had to be Elizabeth who would succeed her, because she was by far the strongest claimant. She was a daughter of Henry VIII, like Mary. So people knew it'd be Elizabeth, but that created real danger for Mary and actually rebellion. Early in Mary's reign, the Wyatt Rebellion, ultimately sought to put Elizabeth on the throne in Mary's place. And Elizabeth actually referred to this when pressured to name her successor. She said, "Look what happened in my sister Mary's reign. There was division and there was danger. I ended up a prisoner in the Tower because I was, the presumed heir." She didn't want to do that to anybody else, but she also didn't want to destabilize herself and threaten her throne by having this named claimant. And I think she was absolutely right. It would have been dangerous. The minute you name somebody, you name your rival. And Elizabeth already had rivals, and most notably Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a thorn in her side for 30 years. So it would have given those rivals even more power if one of them had been named Elizabeth's heir. So she had absolutely no intention of doing that. Now, as I said, I think it was the right policy, but it was risky. What it depended on was Elizabeth living a long time, and three of her predecessors had not. They'd all been very short reigning. The Tudors didn't have great health, but fortunately for Elizabeth, she was the longest lived, longest reigning of the Tudors, and her presence ensured at least a measure of stability. But that question of the succession never went away. And one of the most stark examples of it was very early in Elizabeth's reign, the year 1562. She'd been queen for 4 years when she was staying at my place of work, Hampton Court, which I know you both know well. You visited me here. And she was staying at Hampton Court when she fell dangerously ill with smallpox and almost died. And still she refused to name her successor. And this moment changed everything for Elizabeth, because I think in the 4 years preceding, people had thought, well, she probably will marry or she'll soon name an heir. But as soon as she almost died, that was it. The pressure was on. And she had to face questions in pretty much every single parliament of her reign about the succession. And it became the only thing that anybody talked of, because it had really scared people that the Queen had almost died 4 years in without a successor. And people still remembered, or had family members who remembered, the Wars of the Roses. And they really genuinely thought England would be plunged back into civil war if Elizabeth died without naming her heir.
But she didn't.
She didn't. She didn't. She managed to endure. So, as I said, that really, I suppose it proved the wisdom of her policy, but she took a gamble. You know, anybody would take a gamble on being long lived, even if you weren't a Tudor. You know, life was short in those times. But thanks to Elizabeth being, you know, the healthiest probably of the Tudors, certainly healthier than her father, she did endure. But, you know, she was never, ever left in peace. It was said the question of succession rudely sounded in her ears each day. So she was, and there's this, I came across a lovely letter in the British Library, which I have to say is my happy place. This is where I wrote the book, in the British Library. I absolutely love it there. And there's a letter, which, well, it's not a letter, it's a document. It's a draft of a speech that Elizabeth gave to her parliament in 1563. So the first parliament after her recovery from smallpox, when, of course, the pressure's on for her to name her successor. And she's sort of railing against the laboured orations out of jangling mouths. In other words, you know, what do you know about it? Stop your chatter, stop your pressure, and leave me to get on with the business of being queen. It really did provoke her when anybody talked about the succession.
If we can go back in time from her reign a little bit, it seems that the way that the Tudors and the Stuarts start to get linked is with the marriage of a Tudor to a Stuart.
Yes.
And the Earl of Northumberland plays a part in this story as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so grateful to you, Daniel, because you shared some amazing research with me about this. So yes, Henry VII's eldest daughter, Margaret, was betrothed to the King of Scots, James IV. And at the turn of the 16th century, the early 1500s, she made her way north to meet and, of course, then live permanently with her Scottish husband. Now, this was part of the optimistically named Treaty of Perpetual Peace between England and Scotland. Of course, it turned out to be anything but at least it did achieve, you know, a short-term peace, long enough for Margaret to marry James. And this was pivotal in the history of the British monarchy, because ultimately this union would lead to the accession of James VI in 1603, the descendants of Margaret and James IV. But she stopped her journey at Alnwick, I think I'm right in saying,
Yeah.
and as a guest of the Earl of Northumberland. And I was really touched by the sort of human insight this gives into Margaret's ordeal, really, because she was still very young. She was just in her early teens, and she'd been sent many miles north to marry a man she'd never met. And there's a sense that she was really looked after on the journey. We know she was homesick pretty soon. She wrote to her father, Henry VII, sort of saying, I wish I was still with you at Richmond. She's really missing him. And then she's quite lavishly entertained, as I understand it. And I know you know much more than I do on this, as a guest of the Earl of Northumberland. So I am so grateful to you for sharing that with me. I just think it gives a lovely human detail of otherwise a journey that's just not really looked at. And people just say, oh, well, Margaret married the King of Scots, without actually considering what that meant for Margaret and how she got there. But perhaps you'd like to say more, but I thought it was wonderful.
We know that the fifth Earl, who was nicknamed Henry the Magnificent, which seems appropriate for most of his life, he met Margaret at York and kind of took over the procession from there. Yeah. They got to Newcastle, had a huge feast, then carried on up north. She stayed overnight here at our place of work, Alnwick.
Yes.
They went hunting in the parks here. She apparently managed to get a buck with her bow, so showing off her archery skills.
Yes.
And from there, the Earl takes her to the border and she's in Scotland.
Yes.
So the Percys are there right at the start of this Tudor-Stuart linking. And then 100 years later, that Earl's descendant.
Yeah.
Not sure if I could work out what the relationship. But the fifth Earl starts it. The ninth Earl is there right at the end with the Tudors and Stuarts again, but in a whole different kind of political way. So they kind of bookend the whole thing with several beheadings in between.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. There are always beheadings in this period, but you're right, and it just speaks to what an important family the Northumberlands were. It was a hugely powerful dynasty, and they were always, whether they were in favour or not, they were always forces to be reckoned with. And as you say, very, very neatly bookend the story of the Elizabethan succession. So in an early plug for the talk I'm giving at Alnwick on the 23rd of September, it's really special for me whenever I get to go to the places associated with the book that I have, I'm either in the process of writing or in this case I have written. It really brings the story to life for me. And I had a fantastic time last time I was up at Alnwick. So thank you for inviting me back.
You're very welcome. I think we did book you before the book was even finished.
You were the first. You were the first event booked for The Stolen Crown. And I think that deserves some sort of prize.
A succession, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. We're on the list.
What I was going to ask about is, we've mentioned the ninth Earl a couple of times and that he was one of those potential candidates. Why was that?
Oh, yes. Let's go back to the ninth Earl. So his tenuous claim was through Henry of Lancaster, a grandson of King Henry III. And he was listed in a book about the potential claimants, or a sort of treatise about the potential claimants, by Thomas Wilson, who was a member of Elizabeth's government. And I think he listed 14 people with a claim, and I'm afraid Northumberland was pretty far down the list. Wilson says, this is in Wilson's words, he says, it was too long to tell how many treasons have cut off the Earls of Northumberland. So in other words, yes, he's got a slight blood claim, but they're a treacherous lot up there in Northumberland. And, we can't really count them as viable contenders. So sorry about that.
It was worth a go.
Yeah.
But It does seem from the book that Northumberland wasn't really gunning for his own claim. He seems to have been on Team James. There was a nice quote I picked out where he tells James, "I think Her Majesty in the secret of her heart wished you before any creature." So
Yes.
he's sort of picked his candidate.
Yeah. And actually, I think that's my favourite quote almost of the whole book, because Northumberland nailed it. He saw what Elizabeth refused to acknowledge, which is, yes, she might not name her heir, but really, James is the one she thinks ought to succeed her. And so Northumberland was obviously very close to Elizabeth to have correctly judged the situation. And he and the other powerful members of Elizabeth's court saw how it was all about actions, not words. Or as I think Elizabeth herself said, deeds speak louder than words. And she might not have named James, but when you look at what she did to the other claimants, she wasn't very nice to them, imprisoning the Grey sisters and imprisoning Lady Margaret Stanley on virtually no evidence whatsoever. And even poor old Henry Hastings, whose claim was very strong, actually, but didn't want to press it at all. He was loyal to Elizabeth. She kept him out in the political wilderness for years because she didn't trust him. Whereas James, she starts up this very long correspondence with James from his infancy, really. And it's a correspondence that endured for well over 20 years, almost 30 years, actually. And one of the longest standing set of letters between any monarchs in this period. So they sent more letters to each other than pretty much any other heads of state in the Tudor period and the Stuart period, I should say. And really these letters are on the surface like the letters between Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, full of deference and admiration. And James calls Elizabeth his dearest mother, and she calls him her brother and fellow prince. And the letters have a very definite purpose, apart from all the flowery sentiments. Elizabeth is trying to sort of train James, to shape him into a future King of England. She's trying to pass on the pearls of wisdom that have ensured such a successful reign for herself. For example, she tells him on one occasion to play the king. In other words, you need to show yourself to your people. You need to be magnificent. They really appreciate that. Well, unfortunately, James just paid lip service to all of these lessons, all of this advice. And I think actually he was quite irritated by it. He didn't think a woman knew anything about how to rule a kingdom, so he disregarded it. The moment he became king, it was as if he'd never had any advice from Elizabeth. He completely ignored it. And really, the result speaks for itself, because James very rapidly started to lose his grip on the English throne. And that's a big reason why he insisted that William Camden take up his quill again and finish this history of Elizabeth and rewrite the succession in his favour, so that really his English subjects would have proof that he was supposed to be king, that Elizabeth wanted him as king, even if he had to lie about it. So yeah, it's if James had heeded Elizabeth's advice, I do think things might have turned out very differently.
Speaking of his subjects, obviously this is a lot of the people in power influencing who was the successor.
Yeah.
What did the regular people of England think? Were they bothered about who was on the throne? Did it really affect their lives that much?
It's such a good question, because we so often just don't know. We talk about, who people wanted, but by people we mean those in power. And it's really hard to get to what the ordinary people of England actually felt. There are some little insights, though. The Scots were not popular, as I mentioned. They were referred to as beggarly blue caps and other worse nicknames. But the people of England seem to have wanted anybody but a Scot on the throne. They were entirely in tune with Henry VIII's view of things. The Scots are our longest standing mortal enemies and rivals. They should have no part of England. And I think it's telling as well that when James was declared king on Elizabeth's death, there wasn't exactly widespread rejoicing. In fact, there was unrest in many towns and cities across England. And one official in Northampton, in the sort of East Midlands of England, he received the proclamation of James's accession, like all of the other local officials, but he refused to believe it. He said, "I'm not going to tell the people of Northampton that James is king because I have to be sure of it myself, because they're not going to like it," basically. So he waited for the council to send him an assurance signed by every member of the council that James really was the new King of England. So I think that sort of insight speaks volumes for what I think was a groundswell of hostility towards this King of Scots wearing a crown of England.
And presumably for a lot of the ordinary people of England, for the past 44 years, most of people's lifetimes, they would have known no other person on the throne. Yes. So it would have been quite a big change to suddenly have not just a king, but a King of Scotland.
Exactly. And you're right. Just as with our late Queen Elizabeth II, most people couldn't remember a time when Elizabeth hadn't been on the throne. This is an age where, the average life expectancy is around 35 to 40. She'd reigned for 44 years. So there was this real sense of gathering doom, of a crisis, and people genuinely did fear civil war, as I say. And you do get this. I've written a history of the monarchy, and you definitely get this towards the end of a very long reign. There's this real sense of fear and instability because people are used to one monarch, and good or bad, and they don't necessarily want the disruption that will follow. I mean, I still remember around the millennium, and this sense that, oh God, the turn of a new century, a new millennium, and it's all, everything will crash. There'll be all sorts of problems, and that's the comparison I like to make between the sort of change of monarch, a change of dynasty, and something we can relate to. And I definitely remember there being an awful lot of fear around what would happen. The world would grind to a halt, and of course, then it came in with a whimper. Apart from the fireworks, there was nothing. And similar with James, lots of people rather talked about this peaceable coming in of the king. But as I said, if you dig a bit deeper and look at the reports of what's happening on the ground in England's towns and cities, I don't think it was that peaceable. And I think people were still very uneasy about what the future held because they were so used to Elizabeth.
And then, of course, within a couple of years, the Constable of Alnwick Castle, Thomas Percy, gets involved in the gunpowder plot.
Yes.
And our friend the Ninth Earl ends up in the Tower.
He does. They're back to being traitors. You can't blame them. Really. But you're right. And I think the gunpowder plot really illustrates how unpopular James became, how quickly he became so unpopular as well. Within just 2 years, we'd gone from celebrating the arrival of almost like this sort of second Messiah in the form of a king. Hooray, we've got a king to rule over us. 2 years later, there's a plot to blow him up and to blow up his entire parliament. And as you say, Northumberland is very much involved in that one. And so, James suddenly couldn't rest on his laurels. I think he'd sort of believed his own publicity about being the strongest heir, and he had all these powerful supporters in Elizabeth's government. But what he then starkly realised was he didn't have the support of the people, and he didn't really go out to win friends. He was a staunch Protestant. Elizabeth was a Protestant too. But whereas Elizabeth had sought compromise, James had sought just one way. There was only his way. As he said, who can't pray with me can't love me. In other words, you believe as I believe, or I'll persecute you. And this was really, pardon the pun, the spark for the gunpowder plot in November 1605. So little wonder that just 3 years later, 1608, that's when James really is feeling the heat. And he tells Camden, start that history of Elizabeth. I want you to finish it. And really, you can see how James is personally editing this book. And Camden himself complains about the numerous crossings out, how much he's had to change. And he writes to a friend and fellow historian, much was altered. And Camden clearly isn't happy about this. He's a historian of integrity. He's very meticulous. And so he does his best to delay things, making excuses. Oh, I didn't feel very well. Oh, I've got all this material to go through. And James is breathing down his neck. Get this book finished. And in the end, they compromise and agree it'll come out in 2 installments. And the first installment of Camden's Annals goes up to the year 1587. So the year of Mary Queen of Scots' execution. And it comes out in 1615. But Camden ensures it's only published in Latin, knowing that most people will not be able to read it. And the second volume, he really takes his time over. And he gets his way in a way, because that doesn't come out until 1625. And that's the one with the succession in it. And it comes out, ironically or deliberately, just a few weeks after James I dies. So James doesn't live to see this justification of his accession, and neither does Camden. Camden had died 2 years before that. But I think the real impact of Camden's book came in later centuries. It has influenced 4 centuries of historians. It's the acceptive view of the Elizabethan succession and how she left her throne to James at the last gasp.
When you're looking at things like Camden's book and the documents, the letters, these sorts of things, how does it feel? Do you still get excited by making these new discoveries?
I do, and I get excited over and over again, because this research by the British Library was so groundbreaking, and it changes everything about what we thought we knew about the succession. For me, getting my hands on the original documents is the greatest thrill. I think I'm an archivist at heart. I love looking at the original documents. It makes the whole thing just come alive and seem real, which might sound a bit odd. Of course, Elizabeth was real. Of course, James was real. But I don't know, when you see their signatures, when you hold a letter that they held, it makes it thrilling. And the British Library and Helena were really generous in sharing their research. I went to look at Camden's manuscript very early in my research, and just seeing that rewriting of the succession, the crossings out, and that shivers down the spine, and just that blatant rewriting. On one side of the page, Camden's original, describing how Elizabeth just dies, end of, no successor named. And then on the opposite side of the page, we have the new version, where she says, who else but the King of Scots? Of course, he's my successor. And yeah, it's thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling, and not a little chilling, actually, to see how those in power control the narrative. And I think in this age of fake news, it's something that people can very much relate to.
And if people want to know a little bit more about this, where can they go to look?
So I have a website, which is tracyborman.co.uk. It has details of the Stolen Crown and of all my books. And of course, it also says about the events that I'm going to be doing. The book's available everywhere, and it's available to pre-order. It's released on the 4th of September by Hodder. There's going to be a documentary about my book coming out later this year on Channel 5. And yes, and do follow me on socials as well. I'm on Instagram and X, and I'm even on TikTok, although I'm not very good on TikTok. I have to say, I kind of tend to forget to post myself videos of myself doing things. I've got in the habit of taking photos when I'm somewhere, but videos I tend to forget. So, but I am on TikTok, and actually Hodder have released a video sort of promoting the book. So do check it out. Of course, though, the highlight of my book tour will be coming to Alnwick on the 23rd of September. So thank you again for having me back.
You're very welcome. It's our pleasure. What might people expect if they buy a ticket for the 23rd?
So, obviously, I've given you some insights in this podcast today, but I will be giving many more in person. And I've just finished creating my my visuals for it. So as well, I'm going to be actually showing people what I mean. I'm going to be showing excerpts from those doctored manuscripts, lots of portraits, of course, in the presentation as well, so that you can actually put faces to names when I'm talking about the rival claimants. There are some beautiful portraits of Arbella Stuart, for example, as well as the Grey sisters and their descendants, and of course James and Elizabeth feature very, very prominently. So I'll be showing and telling, and it's always a delight to just listen to the questions as well, because they often say so much about what people are really interested in. What I'm really interested myself in what resonates with people with this book, because of course it's not out yet, so I haven't yet given a talk. And the things that I think are the most interesting might not be the things that the audience thinks are, and they often pick up on things that I just hadn't thought of. And I remember last time there was a fantastic Q&A at Alnwick. So the pressure is on people. Make them good questions. But no, in all seriousness, it's always just a delight. I get such a warm welcome when I come up to Alnwick, and I love just chatting to people before and after the talk. So, and of course, if you come along, you can buy the book. You can get the book signed, dedicated to whoever you like, and it'd be wonderful to see as many people as possible there in September.
I think that probably draws us to a close. So thank you very much for joining us again on the Alnwick Castle podcast, and we'll see you in about a month's time.
I can't wait. Thanks so much for having me back.
It was brilliant to have Tracy back on the podcast with us, and we hope you enjoyed hearing about the Stolen Crown. To see Tracy speaking about the book in person here at Alnwick Castle on the 23rd of September, please visit our website where you'll find a link to tickets, or search for us on Eventbrite. We hope we'll see you there.
And if you haven't heard Tracy's previous appearance on the podcast, please head back to look for episode 46.
Join us again next month when we'll be back with another episode. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.